And we left off with Nick having this line about hope and how that's a major theme in The Great Gatsby. All right, so let's continue. I'm still a little afraid of missing something if I forgot that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. That's kind of true, right? That the decencies, the decency like ness amongst people is definitely not evenly split. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I come back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more righteous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that the flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. And so now we've got again this constant theme of hope. And he basically says up here, if you notice, he basically says that when he left, so he's kind of talking in the future, and then he's telling us of this thing that happened in the past. So he says that when he left when he left the East last autumn, he was kind of like sick and tired of the kinds of people that he was interacting with, right? I wanted no more righteous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn, right? So Gatsby's like, everything about Gatsby I really don't like, except that he had this gift of hope, this gift for hoping and believing in something, believing in the goodness and the ability to get what you want and to have a great life. And when he talks about romanticism, right here, romantic, he's not talking about like love romantic in this sense, and is commonly used outside of kind of like the high school realm. Romantic kind of means like idolized. Like you have like a story that you tell yourself about a certain kind of situation, and when someone fits that story, they're kind of fitting the romantic version of that. You might think of an inner city kid who grows up poor with like one parent, and then he goes to school and he's really good at football, and then he tries really hard. He gets a scholarship to college, does really well in college, gets picked up by the pros, makes a lot of money, and is kind of like loved by a lot of people. That's a romantic idea because it kind of fulfills this story that we tell ourselves about it. It's kind of like when something goes really well according to plan. But he has this great line that was pointed out in the crash course as well. That what preyed upon Gatsby, right? What kind of like ate him up was the foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams. So he's like, it's almost like his dreams had this exhaust, this byproduct that polluted his world. This foul dust that was a pollution caused by his dreams, right? So now we've got this idea. What page are we on here? So now we've got this idea that dreaming and hoping can have truly terrible consequences, as I was mentioning in our last video. And so that's going to be kind of one of our constant themes here. Dreaming has exhaust. Forgive my spelling, I can't spell at all. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in the Middle Western city for 3 generations. The Caraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. So now I've got the story of kind of like a bastardized version of the American dream, right? The American dream is that you work hard, you dedicate yourself to a cause, and then you are able to reap the rewards of that hard work, right? And so normally the story, right, if this person was supposed to fight in the Civil War, would be that they go to war, and then they do well, they get rewarded, they come back home, they work hard, they start a business, they make a fortune, right? But in this version, right, this guy sends a substitute, right? So he's already kind of like a half, an incomplete version of the romantic idea of American dream. Right, and then he also mentions this part about how they have a tradition that they're descended from the Dukes, right? But how that's not really true, right? So you've also got this idea that kind of people are telling us, people tell stories, and people tell stories and not the truth. Right, and so now we've got this, now we can kind of see how the story is going to lay out, right? We're going to see a lot of people who are going to say one thing. Really, they're going to kind of like tell a story about something, and then it will not be true. And here we've got Fitzgerald who's kind of saying, right, that he's saying that the American dream is a story that's not true. All right, let's keep going. Very cool. I never saw the great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him. See, so now we've got this idea that Nick is kind of another version of his uncle, right? He's another version of this person who's going to be sending a substitute into the Civil War. So Nick's going to be another person who might just kind of like be an incomplete version of the American dream. With special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter-raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Now we've got this kind of the correct version of the story, right? If you think about it, his great uncle was the one who did not go to war and started a business and made a fortune. But now we've got Nick who did go to war, right? And he learned something and he came back, and very much like the American dream, he was unsatisfied with what he had, so he decides to go out west, except this time he decides to go east, right? And to jump into business, right? This idea of the American dream in business. American dream equals business success. And right, he comes back from war, and his town where he grew up, and it's like boring now. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why?" Years, with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east permanently, I thought, in the spring of 22. And I've got this kind of like foreshadowing, right? Permanently, he thought. So now we know he's not going to stay. Also notice that it was not Nick's hard work, right, that allows him to go and pursue this American dream. It's Nick's loan from his dad that allows him to do it. So it's not really his hard work. It's just that he happened to be born into this money. He wouldn't have been able to do this if he had not been born into this money. And again, we've got Fitzgerald who's talking about how the American dream is a lie. That the dream that you can start one way and change and become something greater is not true. And evidenced by Nick here, who requires a loan from his dad to pursue business, right? But the American dream is more that you should just be able to do it by working hard, not be reliant on your family. If you think about it, like Trump, right, was reliant on his parents to give him that loan, right? Not Nick's hard work. Instead, gets loan from father. I'm going to just put American dream dead as a shorthand for this being a potential example. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. I found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow, at $80 a month, but at the last minute, the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. And now we've got kind of this, we kind of establish Nick as a lonely person, right? I had a dog. At least I had him for a few days until he ran away. Oh, Nick is so lonely that his dog left him. That's funny. His dog left him. And an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. So he's so lonely that the only person who talks to him is this old Finnish lady who doesn't even really speak much English. It was lonely, see, we got lonely again. Lonely for a day or so, until one morning some man, more recently arrived than I, stopped me on the road. How do you get to West Egg Village? He asked helplessly. I want to stop for a second and point out, West Egg, again, is the name of the community. When I was in high school, I was very confused. I was like, why do they keep talking about eggs in this book? Yeah, so just the name, like Carmichael. How do you get to West Egg Village? He asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Masoness knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. Notice that he says he had high intention. Why would he say that he had high intention of reading the books? Because he didn't read the books, right? You've got this this idea of Nick not reading the books is him having kind of a fake facade, right? He's like the person who buys a bunch of books to put on his bookshelves at home, so it looks like he's a learned person, right? But doesn't actually read them, right? It's all for show. It's all fake. And as we read through this, we're looking for how people are putting on like a facade, how they're being fake, how they're being focused on what people are going to think of their things as opposed to what the things actually do for them, right? Not reading books is fake. It is extrinsic. Extrinsic. I was writing literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. Wonder what that means. Life is more looked at from a single window. Life is more successful. Like maybe like life seems better when you are looking through one small window instead of a bunch of windows, right? Because maybe it seems like better, less distracting. I'm not sure. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, righteous island, which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals, like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. So he's like, these two things look very, very similar from very far away, but in fact they are quite different down at the bottom, down when you get close to them, right? I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two. Though this is the most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between the two huge places that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hôtel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion, or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked, so I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. So we've also got this idea that Nick is kind of like he's always able to see what he doesn't have, right? So he's surrounded by all these millionaires, and he's like constantly reminded that he is not a millionaire, right? So he's like constantly surrounded by what he doesn't have. Must be depressing too, right? Across the courtesy bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college. And just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. So this is quite possibly one of the most depressing ways to ever be described in your life. I can't remember if we talked about this in Crash Course or not, but here we go. Her husband, this is Tom, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure, in a way, one of those men who reach such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterward savors of anticlimax. So just a note, particularly to my athletes, as someone who was very focused on becoming a Division I athlete when I was in high school, don't let your success at 21 be the peak of your success, right? Make sure that you keep growing, you keep improving at something. Very literally, make sure you don't get fat after you leave college. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he'd brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. All right, now we've got kind of like all these details that kind of paint the picture of what? They paint the picture that Tom has so much money that he can just like throw it away. So much money that he can bring a bunch of polo horses down to where he's living now. And why does he do that? Because he worked really hard? No, right? Because he was given this money. So I guess we've got another example of like Tom is not the American dream. He is kind of aristocracy, right? Aristocracy is like royalty, but not quite so much related to blood. Why they came east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France, for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully, wherever people played polo and were rich together. So we've got this very different, this very contrasting image between Tom and Daisy and Nick. Right, Nick has moved to the east in order to pursue business. And we've got Tom and Daisy who were just so rich they didn't know what to do. They just ended up here, right? Because they're just like wandering around spending money and doing nothing. Which is not usually a good view that people are going to have of you, right? If that's what you do, people aren't going to be saying like really positive things about you. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever, seeking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And now we've got kind of like what drives Tom, right? Tom is driven by kind of like looking for the drama and excitement of his youth. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening, I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Oh, that's a great line, right? He calls them these two old friends that he scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected. A cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan, in riding clothes, was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30, with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. I've got this great image of him kind of described as like almost like a machine, or actually, you know what he's probably kind of more described like? He's kind of described like a horse. He's described kind of like the horses that he rides. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked. And there were men at New Haven who had hated his guts. Now, don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him, with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. So remember at the beginning when Nick talks about how men of a certain ilk really are drawn to him because he's not as judgmental as other people. And here's another example, right? Tom is very drawn to him. Tom is like a cruel person, but he wants to be around Nick because Nick's not going to judge him as much as other people will. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. I've got a great place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that dumped the tide offshore. It belonged to Domain, the oil man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. Well, go inside. We walked through a high hallway into a bright rosy-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. So interestingly, we've got kind of Daisy and, I forget her name right now, the other main female character in this book, who are described as buoys. And what do buoys do? They just kind of like go with the flow of the ocean, right? They don't have a mind of their own, right? So we've got the ladies described as objects that have no mind of their own. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtain and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows, and the cot wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless, and with her chin raised a little as if she were balancing something on it which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eyes, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too, and came forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness, she laughed again. If she said something very witty, and held my hand, as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the bouncing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered. She nodded at me almost imperceptibly, and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little and given her something of a fright. Again, a sort of apology rose to my lips, almost an exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely, with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found it difficult to forget, a singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. So for my high school-aged kids right now, this gay does not mean the gay that you're thinking about. It just means like happy. So she's got this like voice that makes men who have cared for her. I love that idea that she has like all these men who like they can't get her out of their mind. That they don't forget her because of this singing compulsion, this way of speaking that makes it seem like something great is around the corner. And that's kind of like the promise that she gives, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because what does Tom want? He wants excitement around the corner. But it must be terrible to be married to somebody who always promises excitement around the corner and probably does not deliver much excitement at all. I told her how I had stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. Do they miss me? She cried ecstatically. The whole town is desolate. All the cars have the left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there is a persistent wail all night along the North Shore. There's a lot of sarcasm I did not get when I was in high school. How gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom. Tomorrow. Then she added irrelevantly, You ought to see the baby. I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 2 years old. Haven't you ever seen her? Never. Well, you ought to see her. She's... Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. What are you doing, Nick? I'm a bond man. Who with? I told him. Never heard of them, he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. You will, I answered shortly. You will if you stay in the East. Oh, I'll stay in the East, don't you worry. He said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me, as if he were alert for something more. I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else. At this point, Mrs. Baker said, Absolutely, with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and with a series of rapid, deft movements stood up into the room. I'm stiff, she complained. I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember. Don't look at me, Daisy retorted. I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon. No, thanks, said Miss Baker to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. I'm absolutely in training. Her host looked at her incredulously. You are? You are? He took down his drink as if it were a drop in the bottom of a glass. How you ever get anything done is beyond me. I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was slender, small. She was a slender, small-breasted girl, with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backward at the shoulders, like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-stained eyes looked back at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her, or a picture of her somewhere, before. You live in West Egg? She remarked contemptuously. I know somebody there. I don't know a single. You must know Gatsby. Gatsby? Demanded Daisy. What Gatsby? Before I could reply, he was my neighbor. Dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. It's like the second time that Nick is kind of described as just being like a piece that's moved around. You're going to kind of see that throughout the book. Nick is just kind of, he's kind of boring. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the 2 young women preceded us out onto a rosy-colored porch open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. Why, candles! Objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. In 2 weeks it'll be the longest day of the year. She looked at us all radiantly. Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it? I always watch for the longest day in the year and then miss it. We ought to plan something, yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table, as if she were getting into bed. All right, what do we plan? She turned to me helplessly. What do people plan? What a great point, right? So Daisy and this whole group, right, are so they're so rich, they're so out of touch with reality that she's like, you're right, we should plan something. What do we do? What do people plan? What is this that people do? I don't understand this planning thing, right? She's so in her own rich person world that she doesn't even know how to plan something. Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. Look, she complained. I hurt it. We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. You did it, Tom, she said accusingly. I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great, big, hulking physical specimen of I hate that word, hulking, objected Tom crossly, even in kidding. Hulking, insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively, and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes, in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later the evening too would be over and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase toward its close in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. So we got this idea of, like, on the West where he's from, they've got this idea of hurried from phase to phase, disappointed in what they're having, or like dread of the moment. And then here they're so comfortable with all the things they have. They're just living. They're I don't even know how you describe it. They're kind of like lazying through life. You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy, I confessed on my second glass of corky, but rather impressive, claret. Can't you talk about crops or something? I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in an unexpected way. Civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've got to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man, Goddard? Why, no, I answered, rather surprised by his tone. Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is, if we don't look out, the white race will be will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy, with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was the word we... Well, these books are all scientific, insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out, or these other races will have control of things. We've got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously toward the fervent sun. You ought to live in California, began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. This idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and an infinitesimal hesitation. He included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at me again. And we've produced all the things that got to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see? In the crash course, the dude talked about this great line, right, where we've got Tom, who I love that Tom was like clearly like dying to talk about this to somebody, because like Daisy doesn't care, Baker doesn't care, and that out of nowhere he just like launches into this kind of like monologue about how important the white race is, right? And then he has this great line about the Nordics inventing everything, which is clearly not true at all, right? And he keeps bringing up this idea that whatever he's reading is scientific, right? If someone has to continually repeat something that helps justify what they're doing, probably it's not going to be necessarily true, right? I also find it funny that Tom has all of this money and all of this time, and like the consequence of his time and his money is not that he is like enlightened, and it's not that he has like learned about philosophy and has actually learned real science. I love that he has all of his money, he has all of his time to really dedicate to his education. And what has he learned? He has learned all of the wrong information. There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough for him anymore. When, almost immediately, the telephone rang inside, and the butler left the porch, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned toward me. I'll tell you a family secret, she whispered enthusiastically. It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose? That's why I came over tonight. Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for some people in New York that had a silver service for 200 people. He had to polish it from morning till night until finally it began to affect his nose. Things went from bad to worse, suggested Baker. Yes, things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position. For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her with lingering regret, like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. So again, we've got this idea that right here, we've got this idea that Daisy is like literally attractive, like men come to her, people come to her, right? And Gatsby is also going to be attracted to her. The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he? She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. An absolute rose? This was untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her as if her heart was trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw her napkin onto the table and excused herself and went into the house. I love it. He's like, this is clearly not true at all, but still he feels like warmth from her, right? And how does she describe him a rose? And what does a rose do? Does a rose help people? Does a rose like actively change things? Does a rose save lives? Does a rose confront problems? Nope. A rose sits there, right? And until it dies and doesn't do anything. Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when she sat up alertly and said, "Shh," in a warning voice. A subdued impressioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward, unashamed, trying to hear. So we got this idea that Baker is just like a gossip, right? The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor, I said. Don't talk. I want to hear what happens. Is something happening? I inquired innocently. You mean to say you don't know? Said Miss Baker, honestly surprised. I thought everyone knew. I don't. Why, she said hesitantly, Tom's got some woman in New York. Got some woman? I repeated blankly. Miss Baker nodded. She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think? Almost before I had grasped her meaning, there was the flutter of a dress and the crunch of leather boots, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. It couldn't be helped, cried Daisy with tense gaiety. She sat down, glanced searchingly at Miss Baker, and then at me and continued. I looked outdoors for a minute, and it's very romantic outdoors. There's a bird on the lawn, and I think must be a nightingale come over on the canard or White Star Line. He's singing away. Her voice sang. It's romantic, isn't it, Tom? Very romantic, he said. And then miserably, to me, if it's light enough after dinner, I'm going to take you down to the stables. The telephone rang inside, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again, pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at every one, and yet to avoid all eyes. I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put this fifth guest's shrill, metallic urgency out of mind. To a certain temperament, the situation might have seemed intriguing. My own instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. So it's interesting to see what's going on here, right? The horses, needless to say, were not mentioned again. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible table or tangible body. While trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee. Daisy took her face in my hand as if feeling its lovely shape, and her eyes moved gradually out into the velvet dusk. I saw the turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be sedative questions about her little girl. I love he's asking questions that don't really mean anything, right? We don't know each other very well, Nick, she said suddenly. Even if we're cousins. You didn't come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war. That's true, she hesitated. Well, I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I'm pretty cynical about everything. Evidently, she had reason to be. I waited, but she didn't say any more, and after a moment I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter. Notice this is the second time that one of this pair has just kind of abruptly started talking, right? Without any introduction or kind of transition into it, right? So it's almost like Nick and Daisy don't talk to each other about anything meaningful, right? And finally, when someone is here that they have even the smallest relationship with, all they want to do is talk about how they're feeling, right? It's like they're exceptionally rich. What page are we on? 20. They're exceptionally rich, but they don't have the most fundamental thing, right? Which is strong relationships and people they care about, right? Very rich, lots of things. I'm going to put that in quotes. But at the end of the day, they don't have, but at the end of the day, they don't have the most important thing. People who care about them and relationships. I suppose she talks and eats and everything. So now she's talking about her 2-year-old daughter, right? Which is quite a, I don't know, not a terrible way of describing a child, but usually that's, this part's only said after you talk about how you love the child, right? Oh, yes. Oh, no, this is Nick talking. I suppose she talks and eats and everything? Oh, yes. She looked at me absently. Listen, Nick. Let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear? Very much. This is a very famous line that we're about to see. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of either out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling, and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and wept. All right, I said. I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. This is a really famous line, which also kind of hints that there's a lot more going on with Daisy than meets the eye, right? She's able to have this like insightful philosophical moment of sadness. That she's not just this person that sings and laughs and is nice to look at and is a buoy, right? There's more to her. It's more underneath that. Right? And why does she think that? Why does she wish her daughter to be a fool? Right? Because she has been hurt herself, right, by Tom. She's been hurt by her dreams not being achieved, right? So she hopes that her daughter's a fool, that she never learns that her dreams have not been achieved. You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow, she went on in a convinced way. Everybody thinks so. The most advanced people. And I know. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything. Her eyes flashed around in a defiant way, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. Sophisticated! God, I'm sophisticated. We've got this idea, right, that she's like sophistication, like she's seen around the world, right? She's been all these different places, and she knows that things are terrible, right? So these rich people have terrible lives, right? Like money doesn't solve it, whatever it is. At least it hasn't solved it for her. And why? Because she's got Tom, right? Whatever's going on is not working for them. The instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. It made me uneasy. The basic insincerity. I don't think that was very insincere. I feel like that was very sincere, right? Sincerity is like kind of like how real her emotion was. It seemed quite real to me. It made me uneasy, as though the whole evening had been a trick of some sort to exact a contributory emotion from me. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment, she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. So is this secret society this idea that they know the world is terrible, right? Is this a way for them to just act terribly, right? Maybe they're justifying their behavior. They're like, well, the world is terrible, so I get to act terribly. And I know the world is terrible because now I have money and I can see it. It's this. It's kind of like when Drake in some of his songs is like, you should always love one woman and be religious and follow God and be a good Christian. And then you have to ask yourself, well, you've got a lot of money and you've been doing a lot of things around the world. Were you always acting like a good Christian? Or after you've done fun things, are you now kind of settling down and being like, I've seen the world, I'm sophisticated. Now I know that this is what's valuable. After I already had those good things. So you should just skip the good things. Let me experiment and see how not to live my life. I don't know, it's very interesting. Inside the Crimson Room, bloomed with light, Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, the words, murmurous and uninflected, running together in a soothing tune. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull in the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned a page with a flutter of slender muscles in her arms. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a lifted hand. To be continued, she said, tossing the magazine on the table, in our very next issue. Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee, and she stood up. 10 o'clock, she remarked, apparently finding the time on the ceiling. Time for this good girl to go to bed. Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow, explained Daisy, over at Westchester. Oh, you're Jordan Baker. I knew now why her face was familiar. Its pleasing, contemptuous expression had looked out at me from many Rhoda Groover pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Hot Springs and Palm Beach. I had heard some story of her, too, a critical and pleasant story, but what it was I had forgotten long ago. Good night, she said softly. Wake me at 8, won't you? If you'll get up, I will. Good night, Mr. Carraway. See you anon. Of course you will, confirmed Daisy. In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of fling you together. Lock you up accidentally in linen closets and push you out to sea in a boat and all that sort of thing. Good night, called Miss Baker from the stairs. I haven't heard a word. She's a nice girl, said Tom after a moment. They oughtn't let her run around the country this way. Who oughtn't to? Inquired Daisy coldly. Her family. Her family is one aunt, about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to look after her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to spend lots of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her. Daisy and Tom looked at each other for a moment in silence. Is she from New York? I asked quickly. From Louisville. Our white girlhood was passed together there, our beautiful white. Did you give Nick a little heart to heart talk on the veranda? Demanded Tom suddenly. Did I? She looked at me. I can't seem to remember, but I think we talked about the Nordic race. Yes, I'm sure we did. It sort of crept up on us, and first thing you know. Don't believe everything you hear, Nick, he advised me. So we've got Tom who's been like, she's like disparaging me a bit, right? I said lightly that I had heard nothing at all, and a few minutes later, I got up to go home. They came to the door with me and stood side by side in a cheerful square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily called, Wait! I forgot to ask you something, and it's important. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west. That's right, corroborated Tom kindly. We heard that you were engaged. It's libel. I'm too poor. But we heard it, insisted Daisy, surprising me by opening up again in a flower-like way. We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true. Of course, I knew what they were referring to, but I wasn't even vaguely engaged. The fact that gossip had published the bands was one reason I had come east. You can't stop going with an old friend on account of rumors, and on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into marriage. So he was like, he didn't break up with her because he was like, you can't do that, so I'm just going to move away. It's kind of like a Nick Carraway cowardly way of doing something. Nick's kind of indirect, right, with what he does. Very indirect way of doing things. Their interest rather touched me and made them less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I was confused and a little disgusted as I drove away. It seemed to me that the thing for Daisy to do was to rush out of the house, child in arms. But apparently, there was no such intention in her head. As for Tom, the fact that he had some woman in New York was really less surprising than that he had been depressed by a book. That's a great line, right? He's like, I never would have thought definitely would have assumed he'd have an affair before a book affected him emotionally. Something was making him nibble at the edge of stale ideas, as if his sturdy physical egotism no longer nourished his peremptory heart. Already it was deep summer on the roadhouse roofs and in front of wayside garages, where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. And when I reached my estate at West Egg, I ran the car under its shed and sat for a while on an abandoned grass roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright light with wings beating in the trees and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered across the moonlight, and turning my head to watch it, I saw that I was not alone. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion, and was standing with his hands in his pockets regarding the silver pepper of the stars. Something in his leisurely movements and the secure position of his feet upon the lawn suggested that it was Mr. Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. I decided to call to him. Mr. Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction. But I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way. Far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away. That might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. And this green light is going to be a constant symbol. I don't love to talk about symbolism, right? Because it's kind of like Englishy and boring. But this green light is going to be a symbol for the thing that kind of like a Gatsby wants. And when I go for a run every morning by my house, there's this house that has this really ugly green light. I hope that person never listens to this. But it always reminds me of Gatsby. It always reminds me of kind of like the dreams that we have. And that's what Gatsby's doing, right? Instead of progressing in life somehow, instead of like taking steps to do something, he's staring at this green light. He's focused on the green light. And he just looks at it, right? Those are all of his dreams, all of his goals. They're right there. And where is that dock? That dock is at Daisy's house. Well, that's the end of chapter 1. Well done, you got there. Until next time.